Greetings, and welcome to the All Facts Matter podcast, where we push back against corporate media propaganda with facts, evidence, and data. I'm Peter, the author of All Facts Matter. Let's begin. Vladimir Lenin is supposed to have once observed that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And certainly the past week, and quite possibly the coming week, are weeks where, at the very least, years have happened and will have happened in Syria, as a civil war which had been largely dormant since 2020 has flared up again, with rebel forces pushing out of the Idlib province in northern Syria, first towards Aleppo, and then towards Hama, in a fairly rapid advance that has the potential at this point to very quickly topple the Assad regime if it continues unchecked as it has been. And so, if the current pace of events continues, before long we could be discussing the end of the Assad regime in Syria. Now, this offensive began on November 27th, which is just 8 days ago. This began when rebels with the force, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, staged attacks on multiple cities west of Aleppo, which is Syria's largest city, with support from the Turkish artillery. Turkish artillery delivered several artillery barrages against Syrian positions just west of Aleppo to open things up. And the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham rebels began moving eastward into the region around Aleppo, and it was not clear initially what their end game was. And in fact, Turkey initially claimed that the rebel objectives were limited. That the rebel assaults on the cities west of Aleppo was a limited operation, and that the objectives were simply to kind of restore the earlier borders of the de-escalation zone that had been established in the 2020 ceasefire. And that was supposedly all it was. This was a limited operation. However, by November 30th, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces had occupied the Aleppo airport. They had pushed the government forces out of the city, and were basically taking over the city. And it was quite clear at this point that their operation was not quite so limited, particularly because not only had they taken over the city of Aleppo, but they were pushing south rapidly towards the next largest city, the third largest city in Syria, that being Hama. Now, by December the 4th, just 4 days later, which was yesterday, the rebels were starting to encircle the city from the west and from the east and from the west, and at the same time they've been pushing out towards towards the east. Really, and this is just simply to secure their flank, obviously, but it illustrates the organization and the planning that the rebels have, is that they are advancing down this highway, but they're also taking the effort to secure their flanks as they go, so that they're not going to be vulnerable. So this is not just simply a strike to inflict damage, but this is a seize and hold kind of operation that is unfolding. And the rebels were quite confident that they were going to be taking over Hama by midday, as they started telling the Christians in the city not to worry, they're not going to be harmed once rebels took control. But the rebels were quite clearly planning on taking control in short order. And that confidence just kind of illustrates just how successful the offensive had been thus far. Most notably, uh, Russian aerial efforts to disrupt the rebel advance, to push the rebels back, to break up rebel positions, had not been successful in halting the offensive. There had been Russia had bombed certain targets, certain rebel targets, but they were not effective in halting the advance. You know, that, bombing attacks obviously are going to do damage, and it's fair to assume that the rebels have suffered some casualties from them. But thus far, uh, those efforts have not been successful in blunting the rebel advance. And we should note here that the key words in all of this are thus far. This is an unfolding series of events, even as I'm recording this, and what's the situation now and what the situation is likely to be tomorrow morning could be greatly different. This is a rapidly unfolding situation, but thus far, Russia's aerial bombardments of rebel targets has not been at all effective. By yesterday evening, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham had successfully seized control of Hama. Now, what's notable about the rebels taking over Hama is that the Syrian army, this time around, made no secret of it. They announced that they were pulling out of the city. They justified it by saying that they didn't want to endanger civilian lives by having fighting inside the city. If anyone who's paid any attention to events in Ukraine will understand, city fighting can be quite destructive and quite deadly. The Syrian armed forces are saying, well, to preserve human life, we're evacuating the city so that we're not having fighting street by street. But this also means that they are surrendering the city to the Syrian rebels. So while they can offer up whatever reasons they want, the end result is they are surrendering the city to the rebels. And so this is coming literally barely a week after the offensive started, and two of the major cities in Syria have been seized by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham rebel force. And again, at this point, there's been very little evidence of any Iranian support. Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy, has made statements of commitment supporting the Assad regime, but they've not been a factor. Russian assets, Russian air assets, Russian land forces have not been a factor yet. Again, this is an unfolding situation, so we always have to couch that with yet. But thus far, Russian and Iranian support have not proven effective in blunting the rebel advance. And this morning, or this afternoon, the rebels made their objectives quite clear as they consolidated their control over Hama. They've been calling on the residents there to obey the police and respect the new authorities, and that there's going to be a new government that's going to start establishing control, and everybody should just simply obey the new government, that they're in control now. And so it's quite clear that this is not any kind of limited operation, but Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is looking to take over the country of Syria, or at least as much of the country that they possibly can. This is not a limited operation. If anything, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is going all in on this offensive, that they are pushing to take over the whole of the country, and they're going to keep pushing down the M5 highway towards Damascus until they do. And one of the things to note here, and this kind of underscores to illustrate just how significant the rapidity of this advance has been, that it's only 26 miles from Hama to Homs, which is the third largest city in Syria. But once the rebels take Homs, and assuming that they do, there's not another major city around which to mount a defense against the rebels all the way down to Damascus. That the next 90 miles or so, not necessarily completely wide open, but there's not there's not a really a good place to make a major defensive stand. Uh, uh, in the in anywhere along the highway. So if the rebels succeed in taking Homs, they could very quickly advance down this highway towards Damascus. Not to say if the Syrian army is able to establish a good defensive perimeter around around some location along this highway, they still might be able to blunt that offensive. But given their inability to have established any sort of solid defensive perimeter around Hama, and there's no indication they've had any more success at this around Homs. If they can't establish good defensive perimeters around those cities, then it's highly questionable whether they would be able to do so south of Homs. And if they don't, then this highway is pretty much wide open at that point, or mostly open, all the way down to Damascus. And that would mean that once Homs falls, a couple of 3 days at most, and the Syrian rebels could be starting to move encircle Damascus and start to make a play for the capital of Syria itself. And this is the significance of not having any noteworthy Russian support at this point. That the Russian Air Force has not been a factor in stopping this advance. There have not been reports of Russian troops, Russian land forces engaging with the rebels at this point. There's not been a report of Iranian forces engaging with the rebels. And so Russian and Iranian forces have simply been missing in action. They have not played a significant role in blunting this, in any effort to blunt this offensive thus far. Now, to illustrate by just how rapidly things have progressed, by to this morning, there's already fighting just to the north of Homs. That there's been reports of government forces shelling the city of Talbise, which is just to the north of Homs. And that just illustrates just how quickly that 26 miles from Hama to Homs is being crossed by the Syrian rebels. Yeah, that's how rapidly this is moving. And in recognition of just how serious these events have been as they unfold, this morning, the foreign ministers of Iran, Turkey, and Russia announced that they plan to meet next week in Doha, which is in Qatar, under the same Astana process which led to the 2020 ceasefire. That apparently they're going to be try to revive that process to discuss ways to see if they can resolve the civil war in Syria. Now, given the progress that the rebels have been making, advancing first towards Hama, then towards Homs, and ultimately probably towards Damascus, that discussion may very well be how to preserve Assad, not just simply to resolve the civil war, but just how to keep Assad alive. That may mean him leaving the country or something else. But that just is to underscore just how rapidly these events are unfolding. And by the time the foreign ministers get around to meeting in Doha, the situation on the ground may be such that there may not be a whole lot left to discuss. Yeah. At the same time, there have been reports that hostile drones are now operating over Damascus. Now, there's no confirmation as to their origin, but if there are hostile drones operating over Damascus at this point, at least one rebel faction is starting to mount some sort of an operation, whether it's maybe major, maybe minor, on Syria's capital, and that would be an added challenge for the Syrian army, because that would be one more place where they would have to deploy significant forces to try to contain this rebel offensive. And if they're not having any luck blunting the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham offensive in the north, having to pull troops off of that to deploy around Damascus to deal with whoever is launching these drones is certainly not going to make their job any easier. Uh, Also, to illustrate just how rapidly these things are unfolding, this afternoon it was announced that the foreign ministers of Iran, Syria, and Iraq are going to meet tomorrow in Baghdad in an effort to discuss what to do about this offensive, and figure out a way to respond. But again, as rapidly as these events are unfolding, uh, their discussion may be greatly altered by events of this evening. That by the time they get around a meeting, there may not be a whole lot left to meet about. Uh, and of course, again, one of the refrains at this point has been a lack of effective Russian air support, lack of effective Iranian support, lack of effective support from Assad's backers in general. Iran's not been a factor, Hezbollah's not been a factor, Russia's not been a factor, and that is a key reason why the rebel advance has moved so quickly. Is that uh, Assad's principal backers have simply not been around to provide the support that they had been. Um, and to ultimately complicate the situation for the Syrian army, another rebel group in the south, the Free Oran, uh, began launching their own operations around the city of Daraa and along the highway from Daraa to Damascus. They started by seizing a checkpoint near Gabaheb, which is on the highway to Damascus, seizing all the weapons there. And afterwards, they began issuing calls for the Assad forces in the region to defect to them, offering the Assad forces assurances of safety if they did defect, but basically saying, put down your weapons, or take your weapons and come over around to our side, and don't fight against us, fight with us, sort of thing. That these this is another force, and this may be the force has been operating the drones over Damascus. We don't really know, but this is another force that is pushing against. That is pushing against the Syrian army and giving them one more thing to have to deal with, in addition to the rebels in the north coming down the highway from Hama, and pretty soon from Homs. That they're going to have to divert forces away from that to deal with the Free Oran here in the south. If they don't, then the Free Iran are going to be able to cause mischief in Damascus. So this is not the sort of thing that the Syrian army wanted to see at all. This is having to deal with things on multiple fronts, and that just complicates a military man's life immeasurably. Yeah. Now, in the meantime, the Kremlin is still pledging full support for the Assad regime. Dmitry Peskov announced earlier today that they were still behind the Assad regime. That they would be having some meetings, and then they would figure out exactly what level of military support was needed to stop this rebel advance. And once that was determined, then that support would be forthcoming. But again, we have to look at what's not been reported in the past week, and what's not been reported has been a major Russian response, or Russian bombardment, or Russian missile attack, or Russian anything to blunt this offensive. The Russian air attacks, Russian air assets have not been able to halt the rebel advance, and there have been zero reports of Russian land forces engaging with the rebels, which at this point begs the question: does Russia even have the soldiers to spare to prop up the Assad regime? Or are they so committed to their war in Ukraine that they've they just do not have forces to spare for any other engagement? That they may have at this point pulled out all of their mercenaries in Syria, all of their troops in Syria. They have left a few planes, but that's it, and not enough to mount uh, uh, an effective counteroffensive operation or defensive operation to blunt this advance by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces. And if they don't have the soldiers to spare, it doesn't matter how many assurances Peskov gives. If Russia can't put troops on the ground, those assurances aren't really going to mean squat. And that's kind of the situation that Syria finds itself, is that this major highway, this M5 highway, is a principal highway running down from the north to the south in western Syria, and this is where their major cities are: Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus. And the road network in Syria greatly thins out as you move to the east in Syria. This becomes a much more wide open area. The extent of the road network in these regions greatly diminishes, and that means that as rebel forces, if they take Homs and then push past Homs, there's not a lot of opportunities for the Syrian army to gather forces, stage an effective counteroffensive at striking at the at positions along the M5 highway, especially if the rebels continue to flank out and establish and push their perimeter out into the east, away from the highway, so that there's not there's just not a proximity to the highway to where the Syrian army can mount an effective counterattack. Then that's going to that is going to make life very, very difficult for the Syrian army. They don't where are they going to make an attack from? It's like you just don't have many roads in the area, and there's just not many spots where they lead to where you can move major forces around, and that's going to limit the ability of the Syrian army to counterattack. And again, like I said, once you get past Homs, the opportunities to establish major defensive fortifications, there are not an abundance of cities between Homs and Damascus where that's really going to be a feasible thing. And without that, then the rebels could presumably advance down this highway very, very quickly, and very, very quickly get into around Damascus and start attacking the nation's capital. If Damascus falls, then the Assad regime is basically done. And if that happens, then Russian influence in Syria is done. And Iranian influence in Syria is likely done. Turkey's influence, on the other hand, is likely going to be greatly elevated, because the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham rebels will be the ones having toppled the Assad regime. Now, it's not going to be the end of the civil war, because the various rebel factions. You have the Kurds in the northwest. You have the Turkey's rebel, Turkey's preferred rebels in the northeast, and then of course we have at least this Free Iran group in the south, all having their own agendas, their own political ideologies, and none of them exactly have a good track record at playing nice with each other. So it's not like these groups all are willing to operate together. And so if the Assad regime falls, that's not going to be the end of the civil war. It's not even going to be the beginning of the end of the civil war. It may prove to be the end of the beginning of the civil war after many, 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 many years. But it's the next phase, if the Assad regime falls, is that the various rebel factions will start fighting each other, and that could actually turn into a much wider Syrian conflict overall as the various rebel forces start attacking each other. That this is could greatly widen the geographic scope of the war, and how much of that's like is that going to involve other countries? It's hard to say. I mean, certainly Turkey is certainly going to have its hand in it, uh, but Iran is not going to have much of a base to influence, and Russia will be pretty much out of the picture. Interestingly enough, also, if the Assad regime does fall, then Iran's ability to resupply Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, and is backed principally, almost entirely, by Iran. If the Assad regime is not in control of southern Syria, and forces hostile to Iran take control of southern Syria, then Iran's ability to move supplies and other resources across southern Syria to Lebanon to keep Hezbollah going is, at the very least, greatly reduced, if not completely eliminated. And if Hezbollah cannot get resupplied by Iran, their ability to put up any kind of a fight against the Israeli Defense Force, which this is after Hezbollah has already been heavily decimated by the Israeli Defense Force and various Israeli attacks and tactics of late. They're just not going to be able to put up much of a fight, and so this could leave Israel in a dominant position, particularly in southern Lebanon, and certainly against Hezbollah generally, which would greatly strengthen their situation, and give and greatly improve their security situation with respect to both Hezbollah and even Hamas at this point. Both of which are Iranian proxies, and both of which would be greatly their ability to reconstitute and recruit and build themselves back up again would be greatly curtailed if Iran can't provide them with a relatively steady flow of resources. And that's clearly the kind of what we're this is the kind of the scope of things that are taking place in Syria right now. Is that if the Assad regime does fall, then we are looking at a very, very dramatic realignment of who the power players in Syria are. Iran is going to be greatly reduced. Russia is going to be greatly reduced. Turkey is going to be greatly elevated. It's likely that Israel is certainly going to be at the very least, is going to be in a position to largely control their own destiny with respect to Hezbollah and Hamas, and that's going to that's going to change. That's going to be a complete changing of the power dynamics in the region, and this is what has unfolded thus far in a week, in 8 days, really. And in another week, this that is what could unfold within the next week. A lot depends on on if the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham rebels can maintain that the pace of their advance. But if they do, in another week, the Assad regime could be history. And if the Assad regime becomes history, then yes, in another week, the balance of power in Syria and the balance of power in the Middle East could be permanently altered. And that's the presentation that I have for today. I hope you found it informative and found it useful. If you like this presentation, please share it out with your friends. The more people who see my work and read my work, the better. Please also consider making a one-time donation or becoming a paid subscriber to All Facts Matter. I'm entirely reader-supported, and your support is what keeps this work going. So I do appreciate all the support that people are able to give me. So thank you very much for that. And that's the presentation that I have for today. I thank you for listening, and have a nice day.